but not strong enough to demand intervention. I had a section in my original outline about envy, actually, but then I cut it out due to the word limit. From Nye, I then went on to Sarah Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion, which formed a large grounding for how I defined and differentiated anger and wrath. I also took much inspiration from Philip Fisher's The Venom Passions, which examined anger and fear, and Teresa Brennan's The Transmission of Affect, which read how affect is felt between bodies in a social group setting. Then it's helpful for me to detail first the differentiation between emotion and affect, and second between anger and wrath. Emotions for Sarah Ahmed are not psychological states, but rather products of social and cultural practice. They are not isolated and formed from the body, but are part of a practice that holds and binds the social body together. Emotions are thus our responses to the social environment, which makes visible boundaries between ourselves and others. For Carol Tavris, the definition of anger specifically arises as an indication that something in our life is wrong. Within implicit and explicit social rules, anger is the sign that someone has broken them, that someone is not behaving as they ought, and that we're not treated the way we deserve. This ought and expected behavior suggests anger's policing function, a power of retaliation against wrongdoing and injustice that regulates social relations and influences us to behave in appropriate ways. Though anger produces social effects, it stops where there's no innate coordination intended to aggress upon the source of the anger. This lack of further aggression limits the scope of anger to a tightly personal system. Thus, I argue that anger is an emotion where it makes us aware of the social systems that we exist in through the sense that someone has acted unjustly, but it's limited to its host and its aggressors. Affect, however, is much more ambiguous, as it is not solely an individual experience, but encompasses how other bodies in a collective's potential to reciprocate or co-participate in the passages of affect to respond. Affect is more social and contains the ability to affect and to be affected. Its difference with emotion lies in its scale of embodiment, where affect entails an ongoing web of encounters in the various social bodies that may come to experience them. Wrath, though similar to anger, where both stem from injustice, still requires a greater degree of social engagement. Where the scale of anger is much more limited, wrath necessitates the strength of a collective, a group, or a landscape, or history itself to induce change. Thus, wrath is anger by extension, where it necessitates a collective retaliation against injustice grounded upon a shared sense of wrongdoing. Through these theoretical frameworks, I understood that feelings, which are the senses that indicate what we feel, are not only psychological states. Rather, these states are what make us aware of ourselves as social bodies, as individuals who can influence and be influenced by others. Within my essay, violence is the result of certain injustices, whether social, economic, or intertextual, and how anger and wrath serve as our entry point into examining these wider contexts. Thus, the violence which contextualizes the agency to which certain characters are allowed to act becomes foregrounded on how this agency was inhibited and even violated by certain social and intertextual constraints. So finally, we arrive at my thesis. My paper thus focuses on the influence of negative feelings on the interpersonal, intertextual, and social worlds of the Grapes of Wrath and East of Eden, and the circumstances under which anger and wrath are expressed. Anger, I argue, manifests as a sense of injustice, a perception that individuals' rights have been violated. Wrath is anger by extension, but involves a collective not only bonded by a shared injustice, but resulting in literal or symbolic retaliation. For the sake of clarity, I'd also note that the role of feelings in my paper is limited to the thread upon which a web of relationships is formed and maintained. This web is held together by the origins of these negative feelings, those who feel them, and the natural and social environments in which this relationship appears. Within this web, not as a hierarchy, these environments are not placid, but also are characters who affect, witness, and narrate the movement of human activity. I'm invested in how human and non-human agency is expressed or compromised within this web of relations, and the degree in which this web negotiates how feelings impact the way characters act and how a novel unfolds. Now I'll do some close reading of the role of anger and wrath in certain sections of the novels. I have more examples in my paper, but for the sake of time, I'll only do one each. What I found most fascinating about this appearance of anger within the Grapes of Wrath was how it was bodied and directed within a human and non-human exchange. In this passage, families witnessed the devastation of the Dust Bowl on their crops. As it says, "In the morning the dust hung like fog, and the sun was as red as ripe new blood. All day the dust sifted down from the sky, and the next day it sifted down. An even blanket covered the earth. Men stood by their fences and looked at the ruined corn, dying fast now, only a little green showing through the film of dust. The men were silent, and they did not move often. And the women came out of the houses to stand beside their men, to feel whether this time the men would break. The children stood nearby, drawing figures in the dust with bare toes, and the children sent exploring senses out to see whether men and women would break. After a while, the faces of the watching men lost their bemused perplexity, and became hard and angry and resistant. As the day went forward, the sun became less red. It flared down on the dust-blanketed land. The men sat in the doorways of their houses. Their hands were busy with sticks and little rocks. The men sat still, thinking, figure. Here, the family's anger was directed towards the natural environment, where they were angry the devastated farmland could not cultivate crops, leaving them without monetary support. Their anger harked a larger social critique of corporate farms and the tenant farming system, which left the soil overfarmed and unsustainable. The sense of injustice behind their anger stemmed from social and economic consequences, both to the environment which cannot provide for them and economic systems which exploited them. But the environment was also angry in return, and this passage here is actually the novel's first paragraph. To the red country and part of the gray country of Oklahoma, the last rains came gently, and they did not cut the scarred earth. The sun flared down on the growing corn day after day until a line of brown spread along the edge of each green bayonet. The clouds appeared and went away, and in a while they did not try anymore. The surface of the earth crusted, a thin, hard crust. And as the sharp sun stuck day after day, the leaves of the young corn became less stiff and erect. They bent in a curve at first, and then, as the central ribs of strength grew weak, each leaf tilted downwards. Then it was June, and the sun shone more fiercely. The air and the sky darkened, and through them the sun shone redly, and there was a raw sting in the air. The dawn came, but no day. In the gray sky a red sun appeared, a dim red circle that gave a little light like dusk, and as that day advanced, the dust slipped back towards darkness, and the wind cried and whimpered over the fallen corn. The second part is about the travel of the families to California on Route 66. 66 is the path of the people in flight, refugees from dust and shrinking land, from the thunder of tractors and shrinking ownership, from the desert's slow northward invasion, from the twisting winds that howl up out of Texas, from the floods that bring no richness to the land and steal what little richness is there. Here, nature's anger is personified in the severe droughts and dust storms. Overfarming was an injustice upon nature's resources by the cultivation of cash crops without regard for the carrying capacity of the soil. Just like the tenant families could respond by retaliating in anger, the scarred earth gave up. The clouds no longer offered shade from the sharp sun, the sky turned gray, and the wind cried over the damaged corn. Nature's anger toward this over-extraction is personified as a traumatized protest against an unjust exploitative system of agricultural production, where the land could not be farmed. As the families were forced to move west, the landscape remains unwelcoming in its howling, twisting winds, its floods that bring no richness to the land and suck what remains of its nutrients. Here, the environment demands to also be read as a character that can be harmed and can respond to the violence of overfarming and the systems which have exploited it. Anger in East of Eden appears differently in Cal as an individual. Cal's anger is complex, as it is directed at both his mother, Kathy, and himself. Firstly, Cal was never well liked growing up. No one liked Cal very much, and yet everyone was touched with fear of him and through fear with respect. Although he had no friends, he was welcomed by obsequious classmates and took up a natural and cold position of leadership in the schoolyard. If he concealed his ingenuity, he concealed his hurts too. He was regarded as thick-skinned and insensitive, even cruel. However, that cruelty is precisely what haunts him, as Cal's cleverness and cruelty reminded him of his mother, who was largely characterized by those true traits. Cal tells Lee, "I hate my mother because I know why she went away. I know because I've got her in me." That he could understand her made Cal associate himself by lineage and mind to Kathy's evil. Here, Cal's anger turns inwards, where its injustice stems from an inescapable blood relationship. Unlike the social economic injustice in the Grapes of Wrath, Cal's injustice echoes the biblical concept of original sin, as a fate Cal was born into and cannot escape. He thus believes his blood reifies the presence of Kathy's sin, her evil which led her to shoot Adam and abandon their family, within him. Samuel Hamilton remarks that the stories of Cain and Abel and original sin have haunted us and followed us from our beginning, as the characters are doomed reincarnations of the Genesis story. They are, after all, Cain's children. If the Trask families fated to reenact the story, their agency is compromised by a predetermined intertextual fate. Thus, Cal's anger is limited not only towards himself and Kathy, but also to a fate he cannot escape from. The haunting of the Genesis story within the Trask lineage is the injustice to which the characters are confined to. Now, wrath in the Grapes of Wrath. actually serves a world-building purpose. And in Steinbeck's words himself, the turning of I, the individual, to we, the collective. I defined wrath as the feeling which necessitated and entailed a collective, and how a collective affects and is affected by each other. In the Graves of Wrath, as the tenant farmer families traveled west, they formed communities called Hoovervilles, which were makeshift camps. These Hoovervilles were burnt down by local police or farmers, but would be rebuilt each time they were destroyed. So, as this excerpt says, because these farmer families were lonely and perplexed, because they had all come from a place of sadness and worry and defeat, and because they were all going to a new mysterious place, they huddled together, they talked together, they shared their lives, their food, and the things they hoped for in the new country. Thus it might be that one family camped near spring, and another camped for the spring and for company, and a third because 2 families had pioneered the space and found it good. And when the sun went down, perhaps 20 families and 20 cars were there. In the evening, a strange thing happened. The 20 families became one family, the children were the children of all. The loss of home became one loss, and the golden time in the West was one dream. And it might be that a sick child threw despair into the hearts of 20 families of 100 people, that a birth there in a tent kept 100 people quiet, and awestruck through the night, and filled 100 people with the birth joy in the morning. Every night a world created, complete with furniture, friends made and enemies established, a world complete with braggarts and with cowards, with quiet men, with humble men, with kindly men. Every night relationships that make a world established, and every morning the world torn down like a circus. I want to pay attention to some of the feelings evoked here. The families are marked by their shared source of pain, of sadness, worry, and defeat. Their loneliness and perplexity because they were stripped of work and could only rely on their families and other travelers, led them to share their lives with each other. As the passage progresses, we see how more nomadic families from various states in the Great Plains come together to form one large symbolic family. They shared in their losses, dreams, despair, sickness, and joy at new births, and these shared communities became worlds themselves, bonded by their collective struggle, losses, and anger. Finally, wrath results in an outburst, a collective violence. Later, though I didn't include this passage for the sake of time, one character hits the local deputy sheriff, who misfires his gun and shatters a woman's hand. The harm that one sheriff inflicts upon one member of this new community, this new collective, and a new world, entails the retaliation and forward aggression of the entire community. And this section ends with the violent fight, Preacher Casey's arrest, and Tom Joad's exile. In East of Eden, however, I argue that wrath appears in non-human form through the preservation of violence in the Trask family house. The house is the background upon which violence is scripted and preserved in the family. The house witnesses the development of Charles and Adam's relationship, from Charles's brotherly protection of Adam in childhood to their teenage violence. Jealous that Cyrus loved Adam's gift, a dog, more than Charles's, the German knife. Here also parallels the Cain and Abel offerings. Charles leads Adam out of the farmhouse and almost kills him. The role of violence lies where the house witnesses its history, which returns to haunt Charles and Adam. Wrath, then, comes not from characters themselves, but how the house is an active carrier and instigator of the memory of violence. This evokes Greg and Sigurd's reading of affect, where a body cannot be defined by itself, but has to embody many forced relations, evident in the memories the house witnesses and forces the characters to remember. In turn, this violence incites fear within its residents, a fear that forces Charles and Adam to act. The excerpt here is from a letter that Charles writes to Adam when Adam is in the military after their dispute. He says, "It's like the whole house was alive and had eyes everywhere, and like there was people behind the door just ready to come in if you looked away. Kind of makes my skin crawl. I never understood why our father did it. I mean, why didn't he like that knife I bought for him on his birthday? Why didn't he? It was a good knife, and he needed a good knife. If he had used it or even honed it, or took it out of his pocket and looked at it, that's all he had to do. If you liked it, I wouldn't have took out after you. I had to take out after you. Seems like to me my mother's chair is rocking a little. It's just the light. I don't take any truck with that. Seems like to me there's something not finished. Seems like where you half-finished a job and can't think what it was. Something didn't get done. I shouldn't be here. I ought to be wandering around the world instead of sitting here on a good farm looking for a wife. There's something wrong, like it didn't get finished, like it happened too soon and left something out. It's me should be where you are and you here. I never thought like this before." The red sections indicate where Charles acknowledges that there's something not quite right with the house, as if it was alive and thus taking on a supernatural force. And each time he feels this uncanny fear, he's confronted with the trauma of his past. Right after he mentions that the house makes his skin crawl, he immediately recalls how their father, Cyrus, never acknowledged his gift. Evidently, the injustice behind his father's bias towards one son's gift over the other, and actually Cyrus' preference for Adam over Charles, is what Charles' decade-long grudge is rooted in. Wrath, I argue, still stems in injustice, but here's mediated through the history of violence the house will not erase. That as long as Charles remains on the farm, he will have to confront the violence between himself and Adam. The house, in turn, becomes more than a witness to their relationship, but an agent that confronts and retaliates Charles's violence upon him. The collective that is brought out with wrath as an affect is made visible here in how the house itself affects everyone in it. As later Adam will continuously delay his return, and Samuel will know that there is a black darkness in the valley. Charles is now affected by and moved, as he concludes, it's me who should be where you are, where Adam was in the military, and you here, taking care of the Trask house. I never felt like this before. As we wrap up, my paper analyzed and historicized the different contexts in which anger and wrath appeared. The examples here depict only a few instances, but I hope I was able to give you perhaps not a summary, but a taster of the type of analyses I did in my paper. So thank you.
Does anyone have any questions about insights?
I know I talked a lot, so very sorry.
Yeah, I can ask something. So thanks for the brilliant talk, and you dived into how the progressive potential of affect to reveal and point out injustices as a reaction to injustice, and how it can serve as a mediator for potential collective retaliation. And I was just wondering if it's possible for affect to act in the opposite way, actually, to as a vector for oppressors to justify and perpetuate their exploitation and injustice, like the ruling class being mad and angry over people trying to revolt, trying to break through these injustices. Like, how dare you misbehave? How dare you try to revolt against me? And so I wonder if this kind of progressive potential is inherent to affect, or is it one side of it? Yeah, so I'm interested in your perspective on that. I hope that makes sense.
I'll try to interpret it the way I think you asked it. I think for my presentation, the way I define affect and emotion is that they're not really psychological states, right? In this way, I feel like everything that we feel are not just psychological in the sense that we feel something and thus we react. But this reaction comes out of not necessarily social context. I mean, the reason why we felt, like why they felt anger and injustice in these situations was because they felt like something was wrong done to them. But then for your example, I think if we're residing in a certain community that has a set I think, script of social rules, and if these rules are interrogated against, or I guess like people again are not acting as they should, then in some way people will of course be angry because that's the morality that they know, right? Like this is how the world should be, and you're not acting that way. And I think no matter if you are the oppressed or if you are the oppressor, I think just the fact that this social script that you have implemented is not being followed will incite a certain reaction out of you. Now, what reaction that is, what emotion that is, I think it depends on who you are and where you stand. But then I think emotions, they're not just psychological states on their own, but I think they're always caused and influenced by some social, cultural context. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you so much for your keynote. I was just in the middle of reading Piece of Human. I love that novel. And I just want to know, like, what's your take on Charles' resentment towards Adam? Because I think at some point he's trying to kill Adam
Yes.
over the
Yes.
night gifted by
Yes.
his dad.
Yes.
What do you make of that resentment?
I think it starts with intertextual haunting. It's very obvious that the parents represent Cain and Abel, even just with the C and A in their names, right? I think at the very start, Charles reflects, I think, the intertextual haunting. But again, it's complicated by the fact that he was very protective of Adam when they were growing up, right? Like when Adam was bullied, he would stand in for him. But then I think as they grow older, when he realizes that, oh, Cyrus, our father, loves my younger brother more, even though I am someone who's worth this love. When there's this imbalance of love between them, I think it then results in some sort of retaliation. There is a part, I don't know if I'm spoiling this for you, but later, Lee, have you met Lee?
Yeah.
Yes, Lee will later say that the reason people feel angry is because they are not loved. And when they're not loved, they feel resentment. and that progresses towards anger. And I think that's quite important because it is the fact that Cyrus, maybe he loved them both, but he did not love them equally. And I think when Charles realized that, oh, like the love that I get from my father is always complicated by the greater love that Adam will get, then that's when he feels resentment, he feels anger. And at that moment when he gives a German knife, which he thinks is something that his father would use, his father's like, I don't want it, I want this the dumb dog that like your brother found. He wants that instead. I think when that moment appears, it's an indication that like his work and his thoughtfulness never do enough in the eyes of Cyrus who loves Adam more. I think that with that at that moment, his anger is only way that makes sense. I think that that's her lashing out.
I quickly make my acknowledgement. I didn't do it because I didn't want to steal Ty's time, but I'll just say like 2 sentences.
Oh, yeah.
The breaking.
Yeah, I didn't say it because I don't want to, I'll quickly do it. Thank you for everyone who came, because this is very important to me because this is probably one of the last projects I've done in English literature, at least for some time in the future, because I'll go on to pursue a degree in East Asian Studies. But I think the pleasure, the pain, and the ambivalence I've grasped when reading Gothic literature really remains vividly true. It's very visceral. So I'd like to thank Tara, who left, unfortunately, but I highly recommend her ENGL 2055 to all of you here. Yeah, right. And just a big thank you to all of the professors and all of the students who came to witness this last stage of our undergraduate degree. And I'm sure this means a lot to all of us. Thank you. And I think that's